So welcome to the Structural Modeling Video Conference for May 19th of 2019. Today, Kevin Dye will be continuing to provide an overview of the SDD playbook. So take it away, Kevin.
And Joe, you're handing over control?
Over to Kevin.
Yes.
No, Kevin.
So welcome. So this is, I think, our third presentation on a new book that's been in development for a while called the Structured Dialogue Playbook, or the Structured Democratic Dialogue Playbook. And I'm going to go right into about page 30 in the book. The first thing we're going to do is spend a few minutes reviewing what we've covered so far, and then we'll do a Q&A, and then I'm going to go specifically to one section of the book, which is a summary of activity in doing a structured democratic dialogue. So I'm pulling up that page right now. Can you see it, Mary?
I can see the original playbook up and the original page, the very first page. So yes, that's up now.
Okay. So while it's loading, I'll just review. We started by doing an oral history of a particular structured dialogue engagement with the National Patient Safety Foundation. And it was a very successful application that was used to bring 4 organizations together on the topic of pharmaceutical safety. That was their first. And they wanted to do events like that around many areas of medicine. For example, patient safety in the emergency room, patient safety during dialysis, excuse me, and so forth. And so we developed what was called the National Issues Forum. It was a model for doing other events, and they wanted to do it more cheaply as time went on. So it became the proposal, which had been customized for them to do what used to be done in 10 days, to do it in 3 days, became a model for other sessions. And that was done quite a while ago. And we use that as a basis for developing the playbook. And I see it's now up.
It's now loading, yes.
Now loading. So the playbook is in the methodology portion of the domain of science model, which John Warfield introduced in a paper in the System Science Journal. And it was based largely on the pragmatism of Charles Sanders Peirce. So what we're talking about is specifically in the methodology section. There's theory, methodology, applications, and foundation. And we introduced the playbook by talking about one specific application that became a model for multiple engagements. And now we're talking about the more abstracted methodology that is applicable to multiple applications. I'm just going to move down here. So in the model, there's a set of deliverables, which is an orientation session, a pre-workshop white paper, the workshop itself, often called the SDD, Structured Dialogic Design Workshop. Structured Democratic Design or Structured Democratic Dialogue is another term for it. It used to be called Interactive Management. A privatization of it was called the Cognoscope. Then after the workshop is done, in the last hour or so, there are organizational commitments, because this was a model for interorganizational dialogue. And then a report would be produced, a presentation package, and a web page is all part of the package. And each project would be in 3 phases: prep, the workshop itself, and then a follow-up and implementation. And in the literature on interactive management, there was almost nothing on follow-up and implementation in the historical literature. So that's kind of breaking some new ground. And the architecture of this started with gathering stakeholder issues from the literature and interviews before the event, during the prep phase. And from that, to try to understand what the most critical things are and what we want, if there's something we want to focus on, or if it's the first time working in a field, we may not want to focus too much. We may want to have a broad view. And then what's listed as the collective challenges in the red, that's an ISM structure, an interpretive structural modeling structure that would be the subject of the first half of the workshop, about 1.5 days in this model. And then the action options would be the second part of the workshop, or about 1.5 days. And then picking, the different stakeholders would pick which options they would agree to do, which would form action teams. And those action teams would be interorganizational membership per action, and they would then come up with a plan. And that was done after the workshop, because the representatives in the workshop that agreed it would be good for their organization to do would have to go back and get buy-in from whoever their bosses are. And there's just a model project management timeline, and it was designed to be able to be done in 3 months. The prep requiring at least 10 weeks ahead of time. And that was given for an organization that we had already worked with, for which they had could summon the expertise in the domain. So this is very aggressive. I've been involved in projects that had a year-long lead time. This is a list of the work breakdown structure. This is the last part, process design, which is largely what this whole book is. But process design for an event, you'll see these are the activities that we're going to be covering, but they're organized in terms of type of task or what the task is doing. So there's process design involved, event management, social network formation amongst the participants and the sponsors, content cultivation, building the knowledge base, often involving literature reviews and interviews with prospective participants, and leadership. So you'll see all these activities I'm scrolling through in the following list, but this is now in sequence that they would follow. So I'll stop for a moment here and see if you had any questions about that.
I lost your screen again, Kevin, and welcome to Janet. I think she's here. Janet, Kevin is not being able to hear Joe, so I'll be intercommunicating from time to time.
Huh, that's odd. Can you hear me, Kevin? No. Huh. Okay.
Kevin,
Yep.
did you hear Janet speaking?
No.
Okay. Janet spoke to you and you were unable to hear her too, but you can speak to me and I'm not sure why.
Okay.
So if Janet has questions or Joe has questions, I'll pass those along. Janet, did you have a question?
Nothing so far, thanks.
Okay.
Well, I had a question about if the document could be distributed. You never answered that.
Okay. Let me, Kevin, Joe had a question, and that is, can the document be distributed? We'd asked that question earlier and hadn't really gotten an answer on it, so we didn't know. Janet said she has no questions up to this point.
Okay. One of the co-authors, the sponsor of this in Cyprus, had talked about doing an on-demand type of publication with Amazon. So anyone it gets distributed to would be under the agreement that they're acting as a reviewer, and they don't further distribute it for now. There's no money to be made on doing it. So,
Joe, did you hear that? Okay.
But
Yeah, I heard
anyway,
it.
he's
Okay, good.
when you go through the publishing process, they ask if it's been distributed anywhere, like a conference or things like that.
Right.
We want to, just for now, anyone we're showing it to, we're doing under the rubric of a review.
Okay, that's clear. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, Kevin.
Okay, so these are
isn't there maybe
activities.
something related, Kevin?
Kevin,
Yep.
Janet has a question.
Yeah.
You need to add the words big data, machine learning, complexity science. I'm not sure what the current buzzwords are. Then you can make some money out of it.
Janet has indicated that you need to add the words big data, machine learning, whatever the usual, or the most recent buzzwords are, and then you can make some money on it. Janet's very astute, but she's also using a lot of terms that I don't always speak. So it might be helpful if Janet were you to type in questions from time to time too.
Okay.
Kevin.
Yeah, well, it's it's actually a good point. Something that I first raised about 20 years ago with Christakis, Aleko Christakis, that when you go to present this methodology to someone, the presenter inevitably ends up in process speak.
Yes.
And that's a disconnect for like 85% of people.
Oh, sure.
Right. So we were called in to do an event with the Patient Safety Foundation as an example, because they were advised to from a pharmaceutical company that our organization had done work with. And we went to do the presentation to them. And the thing that really held sway with them is that they knew we could work in their domain because we had worked with the pharmaceutical company. That's where the trust was. It didn't matter that this dialogue method was one of the only, if not the only, software-supported dialogue methods at the time. But the methodology itself had more journal publications in peer-reviewed journals than any other dialogue. There was a lot of other dialogue techniques, but hardly any of them subjected themselves to any scientific rigor or evidence base. And but if you talked in just the process world, it didn't matter. What mattered was it tying into a particular domain. So I said, we should do a structured dialogue for patient safety, structured dialogue for patient safety in the emergency room, structured dialogue for patient safety in kidney dialysis. And so that's what this was getting to, is that we would create a package that was very reusable because it was domain integrated.
So
Much
it's
like
a substantial portion of the original context, and that context allowed you to economize on the kinds of things that needed to be performed because you had clients that were somewhat already familiar with the process.
Yeah, there's a learning curve for the organization, the client organization.
Sure.
It's very costly. The first learning curve is, do they trust you? So they start calling people that you've worked with, and they want to talk to people that have been in events you run in their domain.
Yes.
And so that takes them a long time, just doing that before they're engaged. And then they got to get comfortable with the process, and then they want to talk about the process and change the process, because a lot of people just want to manipulate. That it's under, they have control of it, and then they confuse a group process with Robert Rules of Order, and then you have to do a 2-hour explanation of how it's different than following Robert's rules, and because they want to know where the steps are from Robert's rules, and we're not running according to that, but that's the only group process most people know, if they even know that. So if you're having a meeting with the client organization, you got 10 people in the room, one of them would have been in student council in high school and heard of Robert's rules, and they tried to follow it sometimes. Most likely not. But that smart aleck then can derail the rest of the organization, right? So then there's a period of defending even after they've committed to working with you. You then have to defend the process versus other processes people have heard about, or they recently read, or they did a search on. I heard about this other dialogue. How's what you're doing different from that? And then they want to have a 40-minute conversation on the phone. And
Kevin?
Yeah.
I have a question, because you've stated circumstances within which you, or the environment within which you've developed this playbook as being focused on already or familiarizing yourself and addressing a certain domain and specialties within that domain. Have you included that explanation as part of your playbook here?
Yeah, it's in the introduction.
Okay, all right. I wasn't sure because I haven't read it extensively or reviewed it extensively yet.
So the way
Another question.
This process gets instantiated for a particular domain or a particular problem is by, for example, activity 1, the research question. And the research question changes for different applications, but the process doesn't change. The content changes. So that's a fundamental thing about structured democratic dialogue, as the Cypriots like to call it, or interactive management, is the content is separated from the process. And the customization is when you put the content into the question, and the content comes out of the stakeholders' mouths as answers to the question. And the process never changes. Now, that's really powerful to own that process and then plug it in to particular application by changing the content without affecting the process. And that approach was already there, by the even in the 70s, I'd say it worked like that. They didn't really change the process too much when they did different applications, but it would take them a long time to prepare for a specific application. to get the content, to get the question proper. Posing this research question is that, tied to developing the more specific triggering question for the event. Then it takes a long time to cultivate the content question, but the process doesn't change. And this is difficult for many clients to understand. And owning this very generic, expertise in this generic process and software for running it is a really powerful thing and almost impossible to explain without getting into process speak. And you get into process speak, you lose the client. So instead of saying, we want to introduce you to structured democratic dialogue, you want to be able to say, we held a meeting with 48 people from different organizations and got an agreement on an interorganizational action plan within 3 days. And we did it in pharmaceutical safety, and now we're going to do it in emergency room safety. And once you do emergency room safety, you can do another event on use of anesthesia, safety in the use of anesthesia in an emergency room. And once you do that, you can do a structured dialogue on use of anesthesia during an operation. And when you present it like that, it builds trust in the client because it shows you have a track record. So that's what I thought it was apropos for Janet's joke. If we did the structured dialogue on something about machine learning, like the ethics of machine learning in facial recognition, because that's a hot topic. Yeah, there's thousands of people who like to be in that dialogue. So let's continue. So in the first, in this aggressive schedule, 3 months out, we're posing the research question and meeting with the sponsor. And right here, we set forth the quality control plan, and that's just looking at all the process points in this, in what I'm showing you, and that can be checked by the facilitation team or the broker. And you see over here on the right, we have the letter B, that's for the broker, and F is for the facilitation team. The reason we did that is because we had a number of events where the broker, the organization or the client wasn't pulling their weight on the project. And their weight for most events is about the content. The facilitation team owns the process, and the view was, that the client owns the knowledge base, the content expertise, or the links and connections and network of content expertise. And on the right here is the number of hours that are typical for each activity. So to meet with the sponsor, pose the research question, we usually spend about 3-4 hours in an afternoon. And so that'd be some prep time that starts 3 months out. Then there'd be an orientation meeting so people understand the following list of activities that they'll be going through. We get members of the client organization or their advisors to articulate what they think are critical problems about the situation. And we do a preliminary interpretive structural model just to walk through that with the client. And this would just be, several people around a table, maybe 8 people is good. And we do it quickly, may not even use the software. We may use index cards and slide them around a table and let people get a feel for things to the left, influence things to the right. How would you move the cards around? And everybody participates and gets an idea of what's going on, and it's not some secret process going on in the computer they don't understand. Then we ask them to talk about who's who in the zoo, as Aleko would say, who's in the network that we want to tap into, who are the stakeholders in this organization. And there's many organizations or people that are not good at identifying stakeholders in their own organization still. So we help them through that. We usually guide them through that with some assistance. So like prompts, like think of the whole supply chain that you're part of. Let's make sure we capture all of those people. Now, where's the role of government? Government must pertain to many situations. What's the role of government? You know, are there regulations? Is there sponsorship? Do they provide funding? And so forth. And and then after the client, the representatives of the client have been exposed to a little discussion from their own experts about what the problems are, some preliminary structuring just to get their feet wet with the idea we're going to talk about problems influencing other problems or actions influencing other actions. And we talk about all the different people that might be involved in as stakeholders. Then we say, okay, you know, client organization or sponsor, you have to commit a certain amount of resources to do this. The amount of time it's going to take is estimated in this one chart right here of all the specifics. We typically need a very senior person to make calls to people that would represent key stakeholders. That usually doesn't take much time of the executive, but it would take time of the administrative assistant playing phone tag with the people they need to speak with. There typically need to be someone involved in organizing things on the client side. A really good secretary is often chosen for that, but I've seen very senior people be put in that role, and then maybe some so senior they have their own little staff of secretaries or administrators, or people that are good at event management. If it's a big company, they may have an event planner. Those types of resources. For pulling together content, you need someone who's really knowledgeable about the network of contacts, about where all the publications are, to have a good relationship with a local research librarian, that type of thing. And then number 8, the most critical, we found that the most critical action to take to make sure a dialogue happens is to set a date for it. If you don't get a date set, it will float. It can float endlessly, that they keep preparing and preparing and then just run out of steam when we don't get a commitment. So setting a date is critical. And the key research there is to make sure you do not set a date within a few weeks of a conference that is going to attract any of your major stakeholder organizations or representatives. So if you're getting a scientist on pharmaceutical safety, you want to make sure you're not scheduling your dialogue within a few week window of a conference that they're likely to go to. So that takes some homework. Then we make a list of prospective anchor participants. Anchor participants in quotes. Excuse me. The anchor participants are someone who, if another person being invited sees that anchor participant is already committed, they're more likely to tip towards going to the dialogue, right? They would like to hear what that anchor person says because they're big in the field or something. So then we outline kind of criteria and set of parameters for prospective participants. I was in a session in Cyprus last January, and it was just a one-day affair, and we were doing stakeholder analysis for for a project in Cyprus where they were talking about how much development they would allow in this very environmentally sensitive area. And there were over 50 stakeholder organizations involved by the time we went through it. And so you don't always have a chance to get everybody that you would like to be in a meeting. I find having a dialogue with more than 36 people face to face, it takes a lot of resources. It's a couple $100,000 event. So you're really usually looking for 12 to 36 people, given what most organizations' budgets are. And so if you have if you've kind of outlined criteria and parameters of aspects of stakeholders you're looking for, then you can combine them. So you want, for example, you want both someone who's good at knowing how the turtle population is affected by things in the Mediterranean, but you'd also like someone who is good at ecotourism, and you cross reference those, and you find out, oh, here's a guy who does ecotourism about turtles, and he knows about the environmental regulations. So he's doing the ecotourism as a nonprofit. He's in the hotel travel business, and he's intimately familiar with international marine regulations. So now I've got three types of participants boiled down to one person. And if you cross-reference those on the net, you often find these combinations of stakeholder that you wouldn't expect. And you can get the number of participants that you need to engage down and still have some trust. You're representing a variety of perspectives. I'm going to just scroll down here to the next section. So within there may be advisors that don't want to participate in the dialogue or would just be there to ask questions. And then often a bibliography would be drafted up, seminal works that the participants should be familiar with before they come into the event. I mean, this is more common in a scientific or technology related dialogue. If you're doing a political dialogue, you may not be compiling a white paper before the event, but I also do that. This would be the time to do it. And these are, the authors of papers in journals are a type of stakeholder. They're a type of advisor. They have some expertise to offer. So it's kind of an extended view of that stakeholder orientation. Yes, is someone trying to speak? No?
Any questions out there, Janet or Joe?
No.
Oh, Janet does, yes.
Oh, no. Actually, did my chat message come through? I'm not familiar with chatting here.
No, it did not.
Where?
There's a group chat dialogue box on my screen over on the right-hand side. It says group chat.
Oh, it just appeared. Oh, I'm looking at
There
your
you
screen,
go.
I guess. That's why it appeared.
Yes.
Let's see.
And,
Yeah.
And actually, Kevin moved off of his presentation to his other and put group chat, but it would be better, I think, Kevin, if you go back to your presentation and leave it there.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll.
That was a mistake. Here we are. Yeah. So
I'll
Okay,
play
yeah,
with my
good.
settings.
if you want to speak to me, type in the message. I don't know why this happened with the Hangout, but okay. So 7 weeks out, the facilitation team gets assembled, by this time, now that we have a rough idea of how many participants are in there and how many people, what the resources are going to get committed by the client and sponsor, then we can guess how big a facilitation team we need. I went through all of the account records of CWA, which was Aleko Christakis's interactive management consultancy. So I went through, I don't know, maybe it was 15 years of clients. And I looked at the number of participants, the number of ideas that were generated, which is roughly how long the event is, and how many steps of the process they did, and how much yeah, so I'm sorry. So it was the number of participants, how much they spent basically, and the number of ideas, and how big the facilitation team was. And I derived an empirical equation that would tell you if given how big you expect the event is in terms of the number of ideas and the number of people, how big a facilitation team will you probably need? And it was usually 3 to 6 people on a facilitation team, although in the rare case, people would do facilitation with 1 or 2 people, and that those are very senior, very experienced facilitators. But this was the project team for the facilitators would be assembled. They didn't belong. They weren't all employees of CWA. They'd get called from around the world, depending on if they had done an event using interactive management in something that had some similarity to the current case, because that gave the client more trust, more sense of trust. So when we went to do the patient safety work, we called people that had done interactive management in the pharmaceutical and medical domains. And they were on the other side of the country. So they were going to fly in to the event. Then there'd be a facilitation team meeting that probably be done by Hangouts or Skype these days. It probably wouldn't be face-to-face, even because there's no consultancy that has enough work doing this type of thing consistently to staff a team of facilitators. The facilitators are networked and then brought together to check if they're available on the date of that event, and then we identify what their role is prior to the event, if any. Many of them may have no role prior to the event except to get there and say hi. Yep, I did this. They say hi to the sponsor or the client on the evening before the event, and they say, yep, I did this event with 30 organizations in this medical problem 2 years ago. It was a very successful, great. And then they come in and play the facilitation role the next day. In the network of facilitators, people are at different stages of learning all the time, because it's hard for people to get experience on live projects. They have to travel around as a learner, and they have to learn different roles. So, for example, when I started with Christakis, I started as just as like a stenographer, to type what people said. If you wanted a record of people's discussions and statements, Now, it would have been better to use a court stenographer, but they're very expensive, and I was cheap. Now there's people that use stenographers. There's a group in Kentucky or Tennessee, somewhere down there. You have, if you set up a good microphone system around the table, it gets sent across the internet to the stenographer in Kentucky. They do it perfectly, and they have it back to you within minutes of the last person speaking. And then you dump it into whatever software you use for presenting your work. And during the coffee break, we produce a physical copy of the dialogue that they just had, and we put it back in their hands, and we say, check it for mistakes of your own, check for your own statements as we go through. And we're going to be talking about each one in turn. You don't have to read it now, we just read it one at a time. And so that provides transparency about what the content is. But I wanted to learn to run the software next, right? So I was looking for an opportunity on an event to run the software. And so it had to be one where I could make a mistake because the software was a little buggy, and if you hadn't experienced the bug, and you're in the middle of hitting yes or no on the software as people are speaking, you don't know what to do. You can be anxiety producing, and everything grinds to a halt. You have to take a break, and the whole facilitation team looks bad. So it'd have to be something that we could have, the experienced person overlooking my shoulder, ready to bail out, that type of thing. Or it had to be on an event that was like a prep event where we were meeting informally, something like that. So that's what we mean by number 16, setting personal learning goals. What does a facilitation team member want to learn? So they're being called in, for example, maybe to take dictation, but they want to learn how to run the computer. Or they're brought in to manage the wall displays of all the statements, but they'd like to do some facilitation. So we give them a section of the facilitation. And everybody integrates that way, and it helps them have a sense of fulfillment while they work for poor wages. And in the nonprofit world and the political world, if you're doing democracy things, then the facilitation team hardly ever gets paid what's reasonable. They donate their time in a lot of cases. So let's see. So by a couple months out, we're selecting the specific participants. Now, stakeholders are kind of a typology or a specific attribute we're looking for in a person. Participants are specific combinations of those attributes. The participants are the real people. And 2 months lead time to go to an event is really aggressive because it's going to be at least 3 days of an event or a day and a half. And but if in this case, we were working with an organization that everybody was looking to for leadership on this topic. So they were hungry to be invited. So we thought, you can do it with 2 months minimum, but we wouldn't try to do that if we didn't have an organization that had pull of a field. You need much more lead time. Especially if people are flying in. If you're doing an event in, say, the wineries of Lefkara in Cyprus, these guys have nothing else to do. If you said, hey, we're going to have a discussion, a week from now, 2 weeks from now, they say, great. All I've been doing is digging the trenches for the vines, you know. So you might be able to be very, you know, chewy to them. So someone needs to be in charge of inviting the participants. That takes a long time, and that's typically done by the client side. We don't do that. We got yanked into it once, and it was not a good experience. But the difference is if the client has some recognition in the field, and you invite them, people say, "Oh, that's great. My company be happy to sponsor me, and I look forward to doing it." If the facilitation team invites people to the event, they say, "How much are you going to pay me? And why should my company pay for your event? I don't know you. Why are you doing this event anyway?" We ended up having to pay tens of thousands of dollars once because of the people in the client role of an event. The guy that was supposed to be doing it just dropped working on it and was kind of isolated. Turned out he was suffering from depression. They asked us to step into the role, and we say we don't play that role, and it's not part of the contract. And they were very stiff about it. And a lot of the people we brought in, we ended up having to pay out of our own salaries. So that was not insignificant. Sending the invitation is not drafting the letter and emailing it. It's a seduction, or a matter of of honor to them. And the facilitation team's not often in position to do it. But now a lot of events that are political, democracy things, nonprofit things, they want the facilitation team to do that, and it needs to be priced into the contract, because a lot of them are used to doing invitations where they just send out a blast of 1,000 invitations and they hope they get 30 people. But if you're trying to have balanced representation of perspectives and stakeholders, there's specific people that you want, or that you're going to select from. Or if you send out a blast to 1,000 people, you have to select from the ones that responded some balanced set of perspectives to represent the stakeholders. So then they're selecting the meeting location, booking it, arranging the social gathering for the night before. And we found one of the ways to reduce what Warfield typically spent and Christakis spent 10 days doing. They'd spend a week on the so-called problematique, and then a week on an action plan. We got it down to 3 because we realized there was I realized when I designed this model, having gone through the experience of multiple events, there's a huge amount of time wasted in not having the dialogue by people. For example, you have an introduction. You got 36 people around the table, and the typical thing, everyone wants to be introduced because many of them have never met each other. We're representing very broad perspectives, so they're not from the same domains of expertise as each other are, and they don't know each other. They feel uncomfortable. Who's who here, and what am I going to be fearful of saying or not? And I've been in sections like that. If you have 36 people speaking for 2 minutes, that's over an hour of introductions. And they don't want to speak for 2 minutes. They want to speak for 5 minutes. And then how do you shut somebody down politely? So instead, we found people were very amenable if they flew in the day before to have a social gathering, a reception. And the idea of a reception is like all the conferences they've ever gone, or many of them they've gone to, they all have a reception. And that actually adds to the trustworthiness of the event. There's actually a reception. And they get to know a lot of people when they're at the reception talking. And the way we did the reception, we had tools to make them go around and meet each other instead of just talking to one person that they already know. So we would be, and the facilitation team would be in the reception, moving people along, getting them to learn each other's names, who's who, and so forth. And the meals were working meals. Breakfast was the same way, the same rules. You know, your goal is to meet someone you didn't meet last night at the reception during the next coffee break. Lunch, sit with someone that you haven't met. Or we often had arranged tables for lunches, so people were forced to meet ones that they didn't know. So there was explicit orchestration of the social network through social things, coffee breaks, breakfast, reception. And so these things about the social gathering, those are typically handled by, the arrangements are handled by the client because they're the ones spending the money on it. But there's a process about the social networking that the facilitation team worry about, and that cut out hours from the dialogue process. Then there's some content preparation. We'd write a narrative of the situation. We cultivate a triggering question. Cultivating the triggering question is actually involves kind of a black art, unfortunately. And then you got to test it. And the only way to develop a good triggering question is to test it out a lot. And as you test it, it will change because you'll realize you said something in a way that is ambiguous or means something different to half the people than you intended, or means something specific to a particular domain that was not true of other domains. And so it takes quite a lot to work out that question, and that's done with the facilitation team. Even though it's specific to the content, we find the client are not good at posing. They generally don't have someone who has any expertise in how to pose a question for a group. So that gets tried out, and that takes a few weeks minimum to try out the question. And then we design and simulate the workshop. And by design, I mean we take what's in this list and we just plug in the specific content of the question and the specific names of the participants and so forth. We don't change the process unless there's, request, a special request. Once, for example, we were working with the World Health Organization on a project for medicine for lymphatic filariasis, also called elephantiasis. And after we got the thing developed, we had a request to allow Mo Brundtland to have a 2-minute video salute or challenge to the group of participants. Mo Brundtland, I think she was the president of the World Health Organization, or I don't know. There was someone big from the UN, and that wasn't anticipated, but that was a great thing to include. So that's kind of the things that they're kind of tweaking the process. So then we produce the agenda, and in the process of requesting or inviting people, we typically requesting bios, and a little packet is put together with whatever background material was developed, the seminal references, the bibliography. If someone developed questions for, interviews for the participants, that would get packaged along with the bios, and the that combination of things is called the white paper. So it's what's going to happen in the workshop, what is the topic of the workshop, the question at hand, the agenda, what to expect moment by moment, when deliverables are happening. Here's the other people in the room with you. There's their bios, and this is packaged up. And then it's up to participants to read that white paper. And we want to get it out with 3 weeks ahead of time. Often it doesn't get out till 2 weeks ahead of time. And it doesn't quite matter because hardly anyone ever reads it.
Kevin, Joe just said that we have about 5 minutes left there.
Okay. Yeah, they read it on the plane there, and some people do read it, but the fact that it's there kind of establishes it better. Anyway, the triggering question continues to be refined, and the white paper may continue to be worked on with the client and a select group of advisors. So I'll get through the next couple lines and then we'll close. And that leaves what happens during the event itself for another next month, or the next month that I'm doing this. So, yep. I'm sorry, what did you say?
Sounds good.
Yeah. So, so by 2 weeks, the white paper goes to the participants. And the key thing to orchestrate, that is the responsibility of the client, that they have to be checked on, is the participants have to have an agreement with their boss and their boss's boss that they will not be interrupted during the 3 days of the event. They will not be bothered with phone calls during lunch and receptions, and their phones are going to be off for 3 days. And that is not easy to get an agreement on, but that's what needs to be done. The facilitation team also checks all of the equipment, all the AV equipment. And sometimes if you have to use the AV equipment of the hotel, you got to check that too. There's many nightmares of equipment. So anytime we go in with equipment, there's backup for each piece of equipment. During here, the mentor, as I mentioned above, the facilitation team identifies each of their own learning goals. And around this time, the mentor, whoever's going to mentor that member on learning, we typically engage them the week before. Then any materials, paper for the printer, make sure you have that. Seating arrangements are finalized, often because we don't, for very important people, we sometimes don't get commitments from them till very shortly before the event, and they say, okay, this person's going to be here, where are they going to sit? Name tags and table tents are printed as close to the last minute as possible without making people nervous. And then the white copy of the white paper and dividers for binders for each section of deliverables in the event are put together. So I'll turn it back to Joe.
Okay, thanks, Kevin.
Right, turn this off.
It was really a great detailed introduction, an overview of this process. Great insights. I'm going to.
Joe disappeared.
We have about a minute left. And
Joe's just closing, but we can hear him.
so basically what we're going to do now is June 1st, we'll have a presentation on the overview of the augmented interactive management approach, where we will talk a little bit about these high-level interactions and activities and the information flow that walks through them. It will probably, this presentation by Kevin will augment what we've done with the augmented interactive management process. To be quite similar. So again, great job, Kevin. Thanks for doing that today, and we'll see everyone on June 1st.
Thanks for your participation, everybody. Thank you for Kevin. See you on the 1st.